Paul Niland, you've been explaining Ukraine to foreigners for years. I'm glad to have you on board to talk about reforms with me today. I need you to start at the very beginning for me. Ukraine is a relatively new country. It has a relatively new constitution. Why do they need reforms already?
Well, the reason why reforms are needed is, we had to go through a revolution to oust the corrupt gang that was around Viktor Yanukovych, who of course fled to Russia because that's a place where the corrupt can find safe harbor. But the reason why reforms are needed is that corruption, it affects and it infects every single part of life, right? And I mean, there was the high level corruption that we were experiencing throughout the Yanukovych years and prior to that, where oligarchs were being enriched and where things like the state procurement system were being abused to hand contracts to friends, and all of those things that we saw were what really were the catalyst for the revolution. And after the revolution, these were all things that needed to be addressed. But when I say that corruption infects all kinds of parts of society, one example that I like to give is, if you look at the death toll on Ukraine's roads, it's extremely high. And that's because people pay for their driving licenses here rather than actually learning how to drive properly. The police needed to be reformed because the previous road police would simply allow any infringement of traffic rules to go unnoticed or unpunished. Because they were simply taking a bribe, and that system worked all the way up. It was the traffic cops that were out on the street, and they would kick bribes up to their seniors, and so on and so on and so on. So the whole system was very, very broken, and it needed to be reformed. And one of the things that I like to say, and there was a recent discussion in the United States at the time of the impeachment of Donald Trump, saying that Ukraine is synonymous with corruption, and actually I'd like Ukraine to be synonymous with fighting corruption, because the things that we've done in the years since the revolution, like reforming the police, like bringing in a new transparent system of government procurement, which is called Prozoro, like the e-declarations of politicians, and so on, what we've been doing steadily in lots of different areas is finding ways to cut out areas where corruption used to thrive. And unfortunately, the job remains half done. And one of the reasons is that, in both the period when Poroshenko was president and still sadly today, we're seeing a political influence over the prosecutor's office. And we still see a largely unreformed or a completely unreformed judiciary. And so Ukrainian citizens and businesses, foreign investors alike, cannot count on the rule of law. The everyday citizen in their interactions with the new patrol police, they can. They're a good and professional organization. But anybody who runs afoul of oligarchs wanting to raid businesses, or that kind of practice, which is still commonplace, there's no recourse through the courts that is dependable and reliable, and the prosecutor's office chooses who to prosecute and chooses not to prosecute people who are close to power or people who are controlling various factions within parliament still to this day.
Okay, the Ukrainian citizen is prone to protest. You experienced this in 2014, and a lot of reforms were brought into motion. Has this momentum stopped now with Zelenskyy, considering the reshuffling of his cabinet in March, the people that he's fired, and old faces that some citizens thought they would never again see in politics? They're back.
Yes, you're exactly right on all of those points. I think, when Zelenskyy, when he campaigned to become president, and when his party was campaigning to get into parliament, there were a lot of promises that were made, and then the initial turbo regime of reforms was churning out new laws all the time, but they were not properly thought through, and that was the reason for some concern in the early days. The concern nowadays is exactly as you say. It is that there are many people who are coming back into positions of power.
Let me
who have
interrupt
no
you there
right
for a second, Paul. Let's talk about the Turbo regime. This is this breakneck speed that when he had the absolute majority with his Servant of the People Party, that he was able to push through draft laws. There was a lot of worry with Western observers thinking that these things weren't thought through because opposition is healthy, because it brings in other arguments. Now, he had the opportunity to make a lot of changes. Now there's rumors that he doesn't have complete control over Servant of the People and he might be losing his absolute majority. He could have pushed through the land reform this past fall of 2019, and he ended up waiting, and people were worried that it wouldn't be successful. If he had so much control over his party and the absolute majority, why wasn't he pushing through more reforms in the fall?
So again, that's a very astute observation. And I said this, I did an interview on UATV shortly after the parliamentary elections, and I said that I foresaw rifts coming with the Servant of the People Party because they're not homogeneous. There isn't, amongst that group of newly elected politicians, there isn't a unifying ideology. There's not a single kind of political position or stance other than new faces. And so there was always the likelihood that there would be a splintering and a fracturing of the party sometime down the line. But it's not just an assumption that possibly he has lost his majority in parliament. In real terms, he has. And the recent example of where Zelenskyy wanted to bring former Georgian president and former governor of the Oblast of Odesa, Mikhail Saakashvili, into government, make him the deputy prime minister and put him in charge of reforms and bizarrely negotiations with the IMF as well. That failed, that effort failed because there was not the votes within Zelensky's own party, fortunately, in my opinion, because I was not impressed by Saakashvili's record in Odessa. There was not the votes in Zelensky's party to be able to appoint Saakashvili. And rather than taking that as a clear sign that he was barking up the wrong tree, what Zelenskyy now appears to want to do is to appoint Saakashvili to his own team within the presidential administration instead. Having seen what Saakashvili did here when he was removed from his post in Odessa, and he came back to Kiev and was an out-and-out troublemaker. There was a period when he and Yulia Tymoshenko together gathered a group of veterans outside of parliament and attempted to kickstart another Maidan. And it was an extremely dangerous situation and an extremely foolish thing to do. But that's Saakashvili, and that's the way. It's the way that all populists work. They find a grievance and they'll pull at that scab, and veterans in this country have plenty to feel aggrieved about. And there were a lot of there was the potential for real problems there with that gamble that came from Saakashvili. So why Zelenskyy is looking at him and why he wants to bring him back, I know that there's an old relationship between Saakashvili and the current head of the presidential administration, but to me, it's just a dangerous move. But going back to the other point that you made about bringing people back in who should never have got anywhere close to returning to power, I think the most egregious example of that is Ilya Yemets, who was appointed and fortunately only stayed in office for something like, it was 28 days. He was a former health ministry official under Yanukovych. He was, when Zelenskyy had the reshuffle there a few months back, he was appointed health minister, and then sought about dismantling the international procurement process that was put in place in the early days following the revolution, and really cemented by Minister Uliana Suprun when she was in office. But what Yemets did was to attempt to get his own person put in charge of procurement, and that's not code. I mean, that clearly would have led to instances of corruption. And while Yemets was digging his heels in, while he wanted to get his own person for their own financial interests appointed to that post, Ukraine was doing zero purchasing of the necessary testing that we need to have and the personal protective equipment that we need to have to deal with and get in front of the coronavirus pandemic. So for a 3-week period, because of an experiment to bring back a former Yanukovych era official who should have not been allowed to do so because of illustration law, we lost 3 vital weeks in preparation for dealing with COVID-19 and for dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. So, there's all kinds of dangerous experiments that Zelensky is playing with right now. And a lot of reformers like the former head now of the Prosecutor General's office, they've been sidelined, and Max Nefyodov, who was one of the creators of the Prozoro government procurement system, he's just been booted out of his position as well. And it's a very worrying time.
Let's go back to Yanukovych. That's a good, let's put a pin in that. You had written an article in 2015 because some women on the street were interviewed by the Kyiv Post saying that nothing had changed after Yanukovych left. Zelensky ran his entire campaign critical of Petro Poroshenko. Has anything changed for Zelensky? Would you be as benevolent towards Zelensky now as you were towards Petro Poroshenko in 2015?
So with both cases, with Poroshenko and with Zelensky, I gave them both the benefit of the doubt. And in both cases as well, it was a majority of the Ukrainian population that elected them. With Poroshenko, he was the first person to win a Ukrainian election in the first round. With Zelensky, the margin by which he defeated Poroshenko to become president was enormous. And you have to give them time. You have to see how they progress. But with Poroshenko, we saw a point where there was a stalling of reforms. There certainly were reforms. We mentioned earlier on the e-declarations, Prozoro, et cetera, et cetera. There were a lot of good reforms that came in the early part of the Poroshenko administration, and Zelensky has moved to do some good things. You mentioned earlier on the opening, although diluted, of the land market. There are things happening. There is progress, but in both cases, the absolute roadblock has been in that joint level of the bodies that need to function properly so that we have rule of law, and they are the prosecutor's office and they are the judiciary. And both of those things are not tackled. And the reason why they're not tackled, and this is the key thing to understanding in general corruption in Ukraine as it relates to politics and political players. The problem is that pretty much they're all guilty of something. So we're at a place in time where it's like a house of cards. And this is why I said earlier on, it's an important thing. One of the best things that has happened in Ukraine in recent years is that we've seen so many new faces come into parliament with the last parliamentary elections. But the kind of compromising materials that Lashko would have on Tymoshenko, that Tymoshenko would have on Poroshenko, that Poroshenko would have on Rabinovich, they're all interrelated. And if you start to prosecute people for political level corruption, then one turns on the other, and they turn on the next, and they turn on the next, and they turn on the next. This is the key now to changing this country fundamentally, is grabbing a hold of those institutions, and it needs to be a requirement from civil society. That must change. We have to have reform. And Hromadske, the former prosecutor general, when he was appointed, and he was only in office for 6 months, but one of the first things that he did, and this never happened under Poroshenko, but one of the first things that he did was he looked at the body as a whole, and he said, all of these people who work in this institution, they all need to be examined. They need to be looked at for their educational qualifications to be in that job. And they need to be looked at as well for their lifestyle and the signs of enrichment that doesn't commensurate with the kind of salaries that they earned. And Hromadske started firing people.
And then he got fired. Let's talk about that a little bit, because he was lauded by Western observers. And it seems to me that probably one of the most dangerous things for a member of the Zelenskyy administration is to be supported by the West. Everyone that is looked at as someone with solid credentials by Western organizations has seemed to be losing their job. Why is that?
So actually, that's a really interesting point that you hit on, and one of the strongest groups that's lobbying in Ukraine and has been for some years is the group of G7 ambassadors here, and they've made a lot of very direct statements, and they're diplomats, and sometimes the language is necessarily so quite undiplomatic and very, very direct. But another source of pressure on Ukraine, and the reason for the pressure is key to understand. It is to reform, to continue reforming. The other group that is key is the IMF, and also the EU as well. So, I mean, if you look back, for example, one of the great successes and huge changes to lifestyles of many Ukrainians was when the European Union dropped the visa requirement for Ukrainians to go and travel there for work and leisure and short-term business trips. But what many people don't realize is that the EU held Poroshenko and Yatsenyuk at the time, they held their feet to the fire. And the requirement to get the visa-free regime was that Ukraine would pass a series of 143 laws that were all around reform. And so if you look at who is supported in government by these institutions, the comments that come from the G7 ambassadors group, the kind of requirements from the IMF, including land reform for the next tranche of much needed support, and the EU as well, you're seeing that the key alignment there is reform, reform, reform.
Well, let's talk about this in terms of political strong-arming, though, because we always talk about how Russia is putting Ukraine under pressure. Is it possible the slow reforms in the fall, were these new parliamentarians actually shocked that what they thought about having their own sovereignty was heavily influenced by what the IMF wanted them to do, what the EU wanted them to do, and that explains for how the slowdown, even though they had the turbo regime in the fall?
Okay, so to finish my last thought, which actually is in part answering the question that you asked, if you see those bodies that are pushing Ukraine to reform, and you see the administration of Zelenskyy or Poroshenko pushing back against people that are being heralded by those bodies, what the clear message there is that reforms are being stalled. Reforms are being held up, and they're being held up for reasons of not wanting to change the status quo, not wanting to restrict certain people and their access to corrupt flows of money. So one thing, for example, that's not been addressed at all is about a month ago, the brother of the new head of the presidential administration was caught on tape offering to sell positions in state-owned enterprises. And there's been no pushback. There's been no addressing that issue whatsoever. And that clearly was, another part of corruption. But to answer the question about sovereignty, I look at that through a different kind of prism as well. And of late, in certain populist movements, the idea of sovereignty has become abused, and Ukraine is a sovereign country, although it's being encroached upon, obviously, by Russia's occupation of parts of the Donbass and Crimea. But the idea of sovereignty for the sake of sovereignty is something. It's a narrative that's been taken advantage of right now in various countries. But what most countries accept is that there's a pooling of sovereignty for the greater good. That's the whole point of the European Union. How certain things are shared, certain burdens are shared between the bloc, so that they can act as one for the good of each individual member state of the European Union. And Ukraine's sovereignty is supported by these institutions that are asking us for more reforms. And the ultimate beneficiary of the reforms, and this is the key point at the end of the day, the ultimate beneficiary of these reforms are the citizens of this country. They're moving towards leading a better life with higher standards of living, with more protections of, as we mentioned earlier on, their interactions with law enforcement, should such a thing be necessary. When you look at, for example, Prozoro and the savings that are made through that procurement scheme, which is, it's an international award-winning model that was created in Ukraine out of necessity. That's being looked upon by other countries now, saying Ukraine's got that right. We should copy that. And Prozoro is saving. It's certainly not perfect. There are flaws. And people are using workarounds, but Prozoro saves the state budget $1 billion a year. And that's $1 billion that is saved to taxpayers. And that's $1 billion that could, for example, be invested in the much underfunded healthcare system of the country. It could be invested in better roads, better road safety throughout the country, all those kind of things, right? So, the pushback on reformers is rightly something that Ukraine's partners are being very vocal about, and the ultimate beneficiary again is the average Ukrainian citizen.
Let's talk a little bit about COVID-19. You're not in the studio today because of this. We can't avoid talking about it. Has COVID-19 changed the trajectory of the Zelenskyy presidency at all? There seemed to be a little bit of reluctance to maybe fulfill the IMF's requirements, but now with the danger of the COVID-19 pandemic, economic turndown, it's really necessary. Is it playing a role in the decisions for the anti-Kolomoisky bill and the land reform bill?
It's playing a role in everybody's decisions everywhere throughout the world. It is a global pandemic. It did certainly focus. There was talk of not needing the IMF tranche, and again, that's politically driven. And one of the key things that you mentioned is the anti-Kolomoisky law. And I saw that Parliament yesterday passed a bill allowing them to fast track that after certain parliamentarians had put forward 16,300 and something amendments to the bill that they wanted to be considered in real time, every single one of them individually, one-on-one. It was a blatant and obvious filibuster. But Parliament fast-tracked that yesterday. The coronavirus has refocused everybody, and I'll say I've not really ever been a fan of Boris Johnson, going back to the days when he was foreign minister, before he was prime minister. But his own experience with being hospitalized with COVID-19 seems to have sharpened his focus. And I've listened to the statements that he's made in the last couple of days, and he still falls short of the mark, but he's certainly much better. So COVID-19 has refocused us all. Before we started this discussion, I was reading a very long piece by Bill Gates talking about the lots of different international elements for trying to find a way through this, and what that entails and how long it's going to take. In our case here in Ukraine, and I noted a couple of days ago what the daily death toll has been, and they're not statistics. They're it's somebody's babushka, it's somebody's brother. But the relative number of deaths that we have compared to other countries shows that the right moves were made earlier on in closing up, in going into lockdown, in insisting on social/physical distancing. And it seems that we got it right earlier on. I'm concerned in the last few days, I'm seeing more and more people saying that the quarantine is starting to be ignored, and there are more and more people traveling and gathering, and I don't know whether people think that masks make us, Superman and immune or whatever. But going back to the question about the effect on Ukraine and the decisions that are being made here, it has focused things because necessarily it had to, and we'll see in the coming weeks how we are able to return to whatever the new normal is going to be, with certainly some restrictions. But I think it's a good rule of thumb that countries that have closed down early or addressed this early. South Korea hasn't closed down, but with their experience with SARS, they moved very fast to test and to isolate and to trace contacts, and they've managed to keep society functioning, albeit at a reduced rate, but they've kept society functioning. But countries that moved fastest and moved earliest will see a smaller number of infections and a smaller number of deaths, therefore, and therefore they'll be able to come out of the other side of this, albeit they will be a closed community with limited international travel. But those countries that acted fastest, New Zealand being the prime example, are moving out of this much sooner with much less economic impact as well. And it reflects the low level of Ukraine's economy that we needed to move very, very fast, not only from a humanitarian perspective of minimizing the number of deaths, but to have avoided a massive economic shock that the country simply could not afford. There was no messing about. There was no space to second guess or judge what might or might not be the optimum moment for going into lockdown, because it simply needed to happen. The country could not have taken a massive economic shock, the likes of which the United States is experiencing right now, with 30 million people having lost their jobs, and the loss of GDP, I think it was 4.9% over the last quarter. They've moved very, very slowly, and it's reflected in 1.1 million infections and closing on 65,000 lives lost now over there.